Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with the people who give shape, texture, and voice to the stories that matter here on the North Fork of Long Island and sometimes far beyond. Some of our guests are rooted here by generations, others join us from elsewhere to share their work, their perspective, or their connection to this community, but all bring something that resonates, something that adds to the ongoing conversation. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 222, we sit down with Gerald O'Hara, author of Breaking the Mauser Rifle. What began with a week spent with his grandparents in Ireland in 1985 grew into a 30-year journey to record and preserve a family history shaped by the Irish War of Independence and the divisions of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Drawing on family memory, inherited stories, and recorded voices, Gerald traces not only his own family's past, but a pivotal moment in Ireland's story, one shaped by two grandfathers who stood on opposite sides of history. In our conversation, we talk about turning oral memory into written history, blending family stories with archival research, and the meaning behind the book's title, and what it means to bring the book home to Charlestown and share it with readers on both sides of the Atlantic. So I hope you enjoy episode 222 with Gerald O'Hara. This episode was recorded October 16th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really great to have you on today.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and to talk about my book, Breaking the Mauser Rifle.
Thank you. And I wanted to start off in the beginning, if you can give us a little introduction about yourself, telling us a little bit about where you grew up in Ireland.
Yes, I grew up in a small town in the west of Ireland in County Mayo, a town called Charlestown. And actually, it was on a crossroads. If you travel from Dublin to Westport in the extreme west of Ireland, or you travel from Limerick and Galway to Sligo or County Donegal, through County Donegal, you will pass right through Charlestown. So it was always a busy town for traffic passing through, but on the other hand, a small town with shops, small stores, no industry in the locality, and all farming country, surrounded by farming country, mostly small west of Ireland farms, and also chronic immigration.
Mm-hmm. In regards to Charlestown, how far it is from Dublin?
As you go due west, it's probably 120 miles from Dublin.
Okay.
And it's also 60 miles north of Galway, and then like 26 miles south of Sligo.
Okay.
Of the county town of Sligo. So, as I already said, it's on that crossroads.
Yes.
In a historical context, Charlestown is in the south of the ancient plain of Laney, which is in modern-day South County Sligo and the northern rim of maybe East County Mayo. This was O'Hara territory ruled by the O'Hara clan, identified by that name from the 9th century. And maybe for millennia before that by their forebears.
And in regards to just your time growing up there, were you always interested in history in school?
Yes, always interested. I just from the house alone and from the books we had in the house, and we had one of my grandfather's medals, his War of Independence medals in the house. And we knew from an early age, that our grandfather was in prison. And it wasn't a bad thing. Mm-hmm. We were quite comfortable with that growing up. However, we were not indoctrinated with hatred for the English. Even my grandfather, as I spoke to him in later years, I never heard him really come up with anything, really bad about the English. Because he just figured he'd been through that war and it was done and it was finished. I think the Civil War was a little bit different.
Yes.
He had different feelings about the Civil War, and I think that sort of overrided everything else,
But how did the idea come about? You said that a week with your grandparents back in 1985 inspired decades of research. How did that come about? Why did you decide to ask them questions then?
Well, yeah, I had always known of their involvement, and as I grew older and spoke to them a little bit more, I always asked questions. Didn't mean that I got answers or got all the answers I wanted, but I had an outline of what they had been through, and especially my grandmother in County Clare, her brother was killed in the Civil War, and a cousin was executed by British forces in the War of Independence. So we knew all of that, but my grandfather on the Cawley side, Richard Cawley, he had been in the Irish Republican Army, he had been in the Free State Army, and he had been a policeman all his life. So he really didn't talk that much about it, and he would speak with his friends, veterans of the war, but certainly not with his children at all. And it's only when I later on, came back and wanted to know more that they then began to open up. And I was really very apprehensive when I went there to meet them, because I knew my grandmother would have no problem talking about County Clare and the great people from County Clare, and she just loved to do that. But there I was very apprehensive about my grandfather. Would he really talk? But I started off, my opening monologue was how important this would be for the great-grandchildren. And I mentioned some of the great-grandchildren by name. So I really put them on the spot that this was going to be recorded just for the family, and that this would, in years to come, this would be really important because of the times that they lived through. And then I started to ask them, I started the ball rolling really about asking about relatives, and then eased in to the War of Independence and the Civil War. So by that time, after a couple of days had passed, I interviewed them every evening, shall we say, for about maybe 3 hours or so. My grandfather began to open up a little bit more, much to my surprise. And eventually I did get a lot of really interesting stuff. Because there were a lot of sensitive issues attached to the Civil War. And it wasn't in the history books when I went to school. Nobody wanted to discuss it. And it had a huge effect on Irish life and politics.
Yes.
Thereafter. Until really recent years,
And also your two grandfathers were on the opposite sides of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. How did those differences shape the stories you uncovered?
Yeah, I think from the beginning, from 1921, when they all had a chance to look at the provisions of the treaty, and I don't know if a lot of the young men at the time really understood what they were reading, but there was no mistaking the two glaring articles of the treaty. One was the partition of Ireland, where we would lose the 6 counties in the north of Ireland. Ireland would be divided, in other words. And the second one was for all elected officials then would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. And I think this, immediately, especially when you have a lot of young fighting men, and my grandfather was certainly not young at the time, they just would not go for that under any circumstances. And whereas my Richard Cawley on the other side, he figured that Michael Collins, who was one of the treaty negotiators at the time, if he went for it, and he was, well-respected Irish leader, and he if he went for it then, and he actually said it publicly at a meeting of his local company of the IRA, if it's good enough for Michael Collins, it's good enough for me. And that was echoed throughout the country. Those exact words that weren't, unique to him. That was echoed right through the country. If it was good enough for Michael Collins, it's good enough for me. And most of them, really were swayed by personalities. Not just by their opposition to the treaty, but also influenced by personalities or brigade commanders or people that they looked up to. And it was a toss of a coin in lots of cases. So for me, I wanted to be truthful and fair in presenting the stance my grandparents took in 1921. Additionally, I want to highlight how divisive those provisions were and the dilemma faced by all those young men and women who had risked everything for an Irish Republic, only to be given a divided island and a tragic civil war in the end.
Yes. And I wanted to ask, because you did the interview with your grandfather, Richard, were you able to do something of the same kind with your other grandfather? No.
Not at all.
Oh, okay.
He died when I was 3.5 years of age, and I do have memories of him. I do have quite a few flashes of memory of him, and he was a very quiet man. He was. Most people in the town, when I would go back years later, they would say, "Oh, I knew your grandfather. He was a gentleman," and then they would follow up by saying he was a very quiet man, except when it came to politics. So I think that said everything about him. It says, about a lot of Irishmen, really, my father included. Very placid, but when it came to Ireland, and certainly the Treaty of 1921-22, there were strong opinions, and it's understandable.
And I don't know if you can say it in here or if you have it in the book, but with talking to your grandfather Richard, what did he think of the outcome, talking about it later on in 1989 about the treaty? Did he still think it was positive or in the end, or was it disappointing?
He was 19 years of age at the time. He was very young, and he was an officer in his IRA company in the small village, even smaller than Charlestown, that he was in South County Mayo. And he was felt very strongly about it, and even about the Civil War. And it's a little bit too long to get into it here now, but the provisional government at the time, they had a majority and they had a mandate. They were the pro-treaty faction, shall we say, of the Irish Republican Army. They, in order to bring an end to the Civil War that was really destructive, and to protect the lives of members of Parliament, because there was an assassination attempt on 2 members of Parliament. One of them was killed, the other one was wounded. So they brought in a law suggested by one of the generals in the army, General Richard Mulcahy, that anybody caught with arms, ammunition, or explosives could be tried by a military tribunal and actually executed. And to compound tragedy upon tragedy, there were roughly 80 men executed, much more so than were executed by the British in the previous War of Independence. And it was that bitterness that carried over from families, especially in small towns and villages, that just prolonged the feelings and the bitterness of this actual war. But my grandfather did say to me during the interview, and I didn't ask him, he just volunteered this. He said, the executions ended the Civil War. As bad as they were, they did bring an end to the Civil War because it destroyed the morale of the Republicans, who were outnumbered, and the National Army were much better equipped, and everything it eventually it brought the Civil War to an end.
Yes.
So, they were the type of comments that you couldn't get those comments 30, 40 years before that. I think I just was lucky enough to get him at a time when he was willing to talk about this.
And was that on your father's?
My mother's side.
That was on your mother's side?
Yeah, that was on the Colley side.
Oh, okay.
So on the O'Hara side, my grandfather, everything on him came from either historical record, or my father, or military archives. But he was a prisoner in England. He was in 2, if not 3 prisons in England, and a prison in Ireland during the 1916 rebellion that preceded the War of Independence.
Yes.
And at the time of the War of Independence, he was what they called a Sinn Féin judge. He was a judge in the arbitration courts set up by the Sinn Féin party and the Irish Republican Army, that they would ignore the British court system and that they would handle their own, have their own justice system in Ireland,
Yes.
And this is a huge step at the time too. And sure, after a while, the British courts, nobody were in, they were empty. And the Sinn Féin arbitration courts had lawyers and judges. So my grandfather was one of these judges, actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, you were recording these stories for your family, but when did it shift into something you felt could become a book?
In the beginning, it was really to get the stories of my maternal grandparents, Richard and Ellen Cawley. And then, of course, their siblings, I couldn't ignore their siblings because they were involved as well. So all that, came together. And then I decided, well, since I've done that, then I will add Tom and Margaret O'Hara, my paternal grandparents. And that was more difficult because, as I said, I had to go through, family lore and historical record on all of that. And then Tom O'Hara's brothers and sisters. And, it just, the whole thing mushroomed, kind of out of control, because everybody had an interesting story. And in the end, there was no question of a book. It was just a matter of getting all the facts correct, getting them in chronological order, getting them on paper, and eventually maybe handing them around to my siblings and my cousins. But in the end, I began to think, maybe there's a book on this. And certainly by volume, even in the editing, between me and the editor and doing the editing myself in the beginning, we edited thousands of words, 5,000 words with the editor, and I probably edited about 1,000 words out, So it was to try and just get the whole thing together and to get it to gel, which I hope it did, was quite an undertaking.
And the project stretched over
30
years.
Over 30 years. Of course, I was doing it was a hobby, really, and it was something I had to do, and I felt I had an obligation to do this because what they did was important. I felt it was important, and it should be recorded. And luckily enough, I had lots of people say to me, you were extremely lucky to have interviewed them, and certainly it was a stroke of luck,
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably wouldn't want to talk about it, or people just might not think about doing that.
Yeah.
At that time.
Indeed, and I spoke to some people in my own village who one particular guy, his father was involved, and he's tried even getting him drunk. Just wouldn't talk about it.
Nope.
Yeah. So, in the end, I think the whole thing, first of all, I started off with Irish history. Then it developed eventually into my great-grandparents and grandparents and the War of Independence, Civil War. Then sort of morphed into World War I and World War II. Mm-hmm. And finally, I did what a lot of authors do. I listed in the end the main protagonists, the end of their life and where they ended up, and mm-hmm. as a finish off to the book, and I sort of linked it in a small way with the war in Northern Ireland, which I didn't cover at all. Mm-hmm. I covered pretty well the reasons for the formation of the historical reasons for the formation of the Irish state, the 6-county state in the north of Ireland. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important. If anybody who is Irish should really know how this came about, mm-hmm. and the reasons for it. And I think when you read the book, you will get that. People will know exactly why we have a separate statelet in the north of Ireland.
Yes. Now, just putting the book together and doing a lot of research in your decades of work, was there a story or discovery that truly surprised you or changed the way you thought about your family's past?
I think there were a lot of stories, several actually, maybe too long to go into here, but I mm-hmm. will go into just one. At one point, coming back from New York, leaving New York, going back to Ireland for a vacation, I would always speak to my father, and he would ask me how the book was going, and he would begin to talk about his uncles. And at one particular time, I remember him saying to me, he says, we had another uncle, Edward O'Hara. He said, I think he ended up in Canada. That was all I had. Now, in the birth records in the county that I come from, yeah, sure, he's listed, but there was absolutely nothing on him. So some years later, I said, okay, I'll just put him down on the record. Some years later, I got a letter from a cousin in Ireland, and it contained a photograph of a guy in a hospital bed in 1919 in Calais in France. And it actually gave the hospital number. It might have said the Duchess of York or the Duchess of Gloucester or something hospital. And it gave an actual specific number. So I deducted straight away that was a military hospital. Now, looking at the photograph, there was nobody else in the beds. He was the only one. So I said, how come looks fairly healthy? He's in a hospital bed in France in 1919. This is a full year after World War I. All soldiers or all wounded patients would have been repatriated to England for further treatment or whatever else. So I began a long search then through Irish regiments in the British Army, searching for Edward Joseph O'Hara, until I was exhausted every avenue and couldn't find him. And eventually, a girl from Greenport, actually working in London and doing some internship in the National Archives, I asked her to have a look. And she found him. And apparently he had served in the Royal Marines. He had been in Gallipoli, in the Balkans, on the Somme, and in Flanders. He fought in all the major campaigns of World War I and survived. It's quite a great story, and certainly a book in its own right on Edward Joseph O'Hara. And then, and it's not in the book then, I wrote about him, everything, and it was all pure research because we had nothing at home. There was a couple of postcards from Canada, actually, at home. But other than that, we began a long search. And my wife finally found him in Canada. And then he disappeared from Canada. And she searched, it must have taken several years, found him in New York City. And then we thought, when he died, we thought he may have been, because his wife went back to Canada, I think, that he might have been taken back to Canada for burial or wherever. There was no record. So we searched further and eventually found his grave in New York City.
Wow.
Yeah, in St. Raymond Cemetery. So that was amazing. And
just your dad mentioning that.
Yeah.
And then going on this whole...
And you know, I had the feeling, you know, all through this, and, you know, especially when I did the research and when it was coming together at the end, that this guy wanted to be found, if you can understand that. And I'm not a flaky, spiritual type of guy. You know? But I had this, you know, there's no way this guy would ever be found. I was the only one in the family who was interested in this. He would have been buried in history. There wasn't even a headstone on his grave. You know, so he was lost for all intents and purposes. You know? And we found the grave and we put a headstone on the grave. I had my brother, two of my sisters, and my mother over from Ireland. And we just, you know, visited the grave. Yeah. So it's quite a story, you know, yes. Just that alone.
Yeah.
And his brother, his younger brother, Gerald O'Hara, is even more interesting, his story. But, of course, it takes too long to go into that.
Yes. And now the title of the book is Breaking the Mauser Rifle, which it comes from a story your grandfather told you. Can you share that story and why it captured the spirit of your book?
Yeah, I think that story, you know, and these are the gems that these guys that fought that Civil War would never speak about from either side. You know, some of them spoke about being in prison, but that was it. But the actual war, you would never hear anything. Neither was there anything written that much. Some of the main fighters, Tom Barry, Florence O'Donoghue, they had written about the War of Independence, but not a word on the Civil War. So I think this story really, you know, captured the whole, you know, tragedy of the Civil War. My grandfather was a reluctant recruit in the Free State or National Army. He had been, he did a test for the police, the new police force in Ireland, and he was waiting to be called for police training. However, in his own village, he heard a rumour that his former comrades may round up people who were pro-treaty. So he fled the village for the second time, this time against his own school friends, and went to the nearest National Army base or barracks, shall we say, which was in Galway. So when he got there, he hung around, and then he accompanied some patrols because he was totally bored. Mm-hmm. And eventually the commander of the small garrison there, about 30 men, said to him, "You can no longer accompany patrols. You have to be in uniform. You would have to join the army." So he thought about it and he said, "Okay, if you you know, give it to me in writing that once I'm called for police training, I will be released from military duty, then I'll join." So he joined up. So, long story short, he went on a patrol, and most of these patrols were prompted by information, because they would get a lot of intelligence. Both sides were getting intelligence from their supporters in the countryside. So that some armed anti-treaty forces were held up in this village. So the patrol came to the village, and the alarm was raised on the anti-treaty side, and the men just fled into the countryside. So my grandfather's, his squad that he was with, pursued one particular guy, a young guy who had fired on them. He followed him through the countryside. Then my grandfather outpaced his squad, and eventually came across this young guy breaking his rifle on a stone wall and concealing the parts of this rifle under the stones and piling the stones on top of them. So he chased him a little bit more, and finally he caught up with them. Mm-hmm. And they were both out of breath and everything else. So he said to him, you're going to be executed for this. Because I think he wanted to intimidate him so he wouldn't run any further or whatever else. And the kid was a young kid, maybe 18, 19 years of age, that he knew the village he came from. It was that close.
Yeah.
And finally, he got back to the barracks and he was with their captives. And there was an inquiry. And my grandfather was called in. My grandfather was an NCO sergeant, actually. He was called in front of the officers, and they questioned him on whether or not the captive was armed. And he said, gave him the story I just told you, that when he found him, he was not armed. So 3 times he was called before the inquiry. 3 times he said no, he was not armed, because just weeks previously they had, as I already said in an answer to another question, that at the request of General Mulcahy, the Irish Parliament granted special powers to the army to try and execute those in possession of arms, ammunition, and explosives. Mm-hmm. And this guy would have been executed, but my grandfather wanted no part of this. And so they accepted it in the end. And he wasn't listed for execution. So that just goes to show how terrible this sort of thing was, Yeah. It was bad enough fighting, people you knew and exchanging fire, but actually, being responsible for somebody being executed by firing squad was just a totally different story, mm-hmm. And this actually came back on my grandfather years later. But of course, you have to read the book to know the story.
Yes, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So I think, therefore, I thought the breaking of the Mauser rifle. And the other thing, my grandfather was very annoyed, actually. Not because the young guy had fired on them, or because he had to chase them through the countryside for a mile or two, maybe, but because he broke as he said himself at the interview, a fine Mauser rifle. Mm. Because when leading up to the end of the War of Independence, they did not, in my grandfather's company, in his IRA company, they did not have one service rifle. They had some pistols, they had some shotguns, but they didn't even have a rifle. And to see now, less than a year later, a young guy smashing, as he said, a fine Mauser rifle.
Yes.
Is particularly galling.
Yes.
Yeah. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious just if you were able to ask him what he thought of what Ireland had become up to 1989, and it's probably complicated, but just where Ireland was going from there at that point, and him just going through the treaty and the Civil War, and then asking, and then probably his thoughts on Ireland at that time.
Yeah. I think he was very happy with the way everything turned out. He had absolutely no time for politicians. He also said at interview that anybody who died for his country was a fool. So I thought that was pretty harsh, but from his point of view, he felt that the soldiers weren't treated well afterwards, although he did very well. He eventually became a policeman. He was in the first class of police officers that were, graduated in the new Irish Free State in 1922. As he graduated and went actually on duty in the countryside, the Civil War was still on.
But he was in County Mayo?
No, He was from County Mayo, but his first posting was to Donegal, the extreme northern part of the country.
Mm-hmm.
This tiny fishing village in the middle of nowhere. And there was a good story from there too, actually.
Yeah.
But he was also very proud of the Irish police force, the new Irish, in Gaelic, they were called An Garda Síochána, the Guardians of Peace. Mm-hmm. So he's very proud of that force and what they had done. Actually, an unarmed force. In the middle of the Civil War, they were unarmed. Unlike the British police, they were armed to the teeth with rifles, pistols, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I think, and he was also very proud of how the Irish police served in the UN and countries all over the world.
Yes.
So I think he was quite happy. But forever he did not like the leader of the opposition during the Civil War, Eamon de Valera, who was a prominent figure all through that period, and did not like that opposition party. But as a policeman, he was apolitical and didn't discuss politics and didn't take sides.
Yes. And now coming up to, it was 2021 that the book was published. What was it like then to return to Charlestown to launch it in your community?
Well, I can tell you, Chris, it was terrifying. Absolutely. I self-published, so I had it edited. The editor was in Ireland, and she was just terrific. And I worked with her, and there was no explanation or anything else with her. She knew everything. She knew the history. And it was just so easy and refreshing to work with her, So that was a great experience. When it comes to actually printing the book, that was a headache, really. And I misread the contract that said that the book would be ready by the printer in 20 business days. And I had in my mind 20 days. So 20 days and 20 business days are not quite the same. And I arranged to fit in with my schedule, I arranged a launch date in the local arts centre in the town, and had to cancel that and put it forward another week of that. And then it was at the end of COVID, and there were still some COVID restrictions. And, on the way up there, I said, will anybody arrive at all? Because, as you know, the people who buy books and read books are all retired.
Yes.
And, who attend events in art centres, they're all basically retired people. But there was a huge turnout, a great turnout, and lots of school friends there. It was just really good. And also a lot of relatives. And there's a character in my book, a cousin of my grandfather's, Peter Brennan, and they were also on opposite sides in the Civil War, and actually were in conflict against each other. And to have Peter Brennan's grandkids there, and I had known them, I had met them actually through my wife, and had known them years previously, but didn't know of the connection. And eventually, coming towards the end, I found out that these guys actually were the descendants of my grandfather's cousin, and ultimately cousins of mine.
Yes.
So it was great to have them there as well, because there is a great story in the book about my grandfather and Peter Brennan. And, I'll leave that to the listeners, that hopefully they will get the book and read it.
Yes.
But, all of that was very satisfying.
Yeah. Probably just there, like you said, there were probably a lot of people that knew, maybe there were people that still knew your grandfather at that time, or it still was probably a new generation.
Yeah, basically a complete new generation.
Okay.
There would have been some people, even school friends of mine, who would have seen my grandfather come visit us.
Okay.
And yes, definitely, people older than me, or a generation older than me, they would have known him, of course, absolutely. Yeah. Even though he would probably be a visitor to our town, maybe once a month, if that.
Okay.
But he would have been known You know, being a policeman in the next town, he would have been, pretty well known.
Yes. And now you've spoken at libraries and events about the book. What has the response been like from readers on both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah, really, it's just great to get an email out of nowhere from somebody who's got the book and read it. And I mean, that's, I think, the greatest satisfaction that an author has. You're walking down the street and somebody pulls you over and says, "I read your book." And then I say, I usually say, "You read all of the book?" Because it's 416 pages, it's quite big. Yes. Yeah, they say, "I read all of it," and then they would tell you that they were very happy, or that they were thought it was a great book. And I had some teachers say in Ireland that they didn't even know a lot of the history, because in the early part of the book, I just gave a quick synopsis of Irish history and the Irish involvement in overseas wars, shall we say, fighting for the French, fighting for the Austrians, the Russians, fighting in South Africa, fighting in America in the Civil War, and the War of Independence in America. So I had to add all of that to show that if we couldn't fight in Ireland, then we were fighting somewhere else, sometimes against the English, sometimes not,
Yes.
So I think that was important to add that. So they were surprised at all of this because we just didn't have a lot of that in school. And also we had nothing on the Civil War in school. So even though there are many, many books written in the last, shall we say, 30 years on the Civil War, prior to that, there weren't that many books.
And it wasn't a requirement, or wasn't, like you said, discussed?
Not on the curriculum at all.
Okay.
At all. In school, or in university for that matter.
Do you think that was...
It was just so divisive.
So divisive that they left it out?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to touch it. Mm-hmm.
So, like you said, for you growing up, you didn't really learn about it at school. It would have been from whether your parents or grandparents.
Even that, it was rarely discussed.
They didn't want to talk about it.
Yeah. No, I think both sides were really embarrassed, by it. They had fought the good fight for 600-700 years. And in the end, they fought against the greatest empire and started off with no weapons, really. And the weapons they stole from the British, they captured them from the British. They imported, trickled in some small amounts of weapons. But it was a marvelous accomplishment to bring the British Empire to the negotiation table. Mm-hmm. And to get a free state, 26 county Ireland, even with the Oath of Allegiance and even with the 6 counties, it was still a terrific achievement. And then, of course, that was fine. But then the Civil War was a totally different matter. To think that all these people then fought against each other. Yes. And the executions and so on and so forth. And I just add a note for your listeners that at the beginning of the war, everybody was shooting over their opponents' heads. Nobody wanted to shoot at fellow Irishmen. So there were very little casualties.
Okay.
And so as things progressed, and especially when Michael Collins, a member of Parliament, Minister for Finance, and Chief of Staff of the Irish Army, was shot in an ambush. He was going to try and make peace in Cork, where he came from, among his own people, and randomly shot in an ambush. And after that, things got a little more serious, both sides. Mm-hmm. And then, they were shooting to kill, by and large, But for all of that, it had nothing on the scale of the Spanish Civil War, shall we say, or the American Civil War. Mm. Deaths or numbers of casualties were not that much,
But just I think it's, like you said, the length of everything goes back a lot further. Yeah. The conflict.
Yes.
Like maybe the casualties are higher for the Spanish American Civil War, but just the conflict has been going on for so long.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think I wanted to ask now just that your book is out and you've been giving talks and sharing it. What's next for you, or is there more writing or more research, or perhaps a continuation of this family story to come?
I think I've exhausted the family pretty much. Or it has exhausted me beyond belief. So I doubt it will be anything like that. Even, I think I've done my best with the information I've had with my family members. Because if they didn't leave any written, journals, then you can imagine, the amount of research to piece their lives together. So getting any further on with the family would be, I don't think that would be on the cards at all. But it's also, I did so much writing and I wrote that book many times over. It's been rewritten and revised and edited, especially in the last few years. So I'm kind of exhausted with actual writing. But I did start. There's something I did want to write about 9/11. And I was in New York City during 9/11, so I wanted to write about that. And I started maybe 10 years ago. I got about a half page done. So last summer in Florida, I got about, I suppose, 20 pages done, So it's an improvement.
Yes.
But whether it will ever see the light of day is another story, Mm-hmm. I have no ambitions for it other than just to record. And maybe not do a little bit differently than my granduncles did, and actually leave a written record. So those coming behind me can pick it up and say, oh, well, he was there at that time. This is what happened. This is what he did,
Yes.
And leave it at that, maybe.
No, that would be good too, because it's different from the book you have published, because that you might have started out, you said, as just recording this but then it evolved into something else over time. But I think just having something whether it's a record of some kind, that's good information for the future.
Indeed.
And also, could you tell people where they could find the book if they were interested in purchasing it?
If you need any information, I will give you an email address. You can drop me an email, and then I can let people know how you can purchase the book. And the email is oldclan.08@gmail.com. Okay. So that is OLDCLAN.08@gmail.com.
Okay. And I wanted to just ask at the end, I usually ask people if they were, because we kind of touched on a wide range of things, but were there any last minute things you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't touched on?
No, I just think where this book might be about my family, I think it could be about any Irish family, because we all have that in our families. We had the pro and anti-treaty. We had family members serving in the British Army. And I think that often, surprises a lot of people. Well, how come Irish people joined the British Army in huge numbers? How come they did that after all the tragedy and wars in Ireland and rebellions and imprisonments and starvation? How could they do that? Well, back in, shall we say, the 19th century, there was no work of any kind, really only farm work. You had large amounts of kids. So at the beginning of the 1800s, in Wellington's army, in the Spanish Peninsular War, maybe 50% of that British army were Irish. So it was a job. It was simply a job. And I think when he came to World War One, there was an uncle of my grandmother then was in the British Army. He was in India and South Africa, and he served 20 years. So he had all that sort of, it was a job, and if you served 20 years, you had a pension. And that was a huge thing. Nobody had a pension in Ireland in those days, you know. So there was adventure for a lot of Irishmen. And then you had families who served, their fathers or uncles served, they joined, so on and so forth. Why Edward O'Hara joined the Royal Marines. And, you know, Marines are Marines. They're going to be the first in the most difficult situations. And he certainly was. Why he did that, we have no idea. You know, absolutely no idea. But I think that's one of the things that kind of surprises people and interests people. That why did we join the British Army?
Yeah.
But if Irishmen and my granduncles, if they joined the British Army, it didn't mean they were loyalists. They were absolute nationalists.
Yes.
They really were. And especially in 1913 or 1914, when World War I broke out, Irishmen in the Irish Volunteers at the time, they were advised by business, by the clergy, and by the Irish Party, which is the political party in the English Parliament. Mm-hmm. They were advised to join the British Army, and the British would grant us home rule. And the war would be over in 3 or 4 months. And then, because they had passed the Home Rule Bill in 1913, but the war broke out, and because of loyalist opposition in Northern Ireland, they didn't implement that Act of Parliament. Mm-hmm. So Home Rule for Ireland and the Parliament in Ireland was left hanging. So you had lots of men, thousands joined the British Army and were slaughtered in World War I because they were advised this was the thing to do. My grandfather did not, of course. He was older, wiser, and probably said to himself, there's no way I'm joining the British Army.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think throwing that in explains a lot.
There's a lot of things, moving parts, and it can be complicated. It's not a simple, well, then they were loyalists, or like you said, with something like that.
Yeah, that they were loyal to the British Crown. No, not at all. And in fact, those who served in World War I, a lot of them, when they came back in 1918, 1919, joined the Irish Republican Army and trained IRA volunteers. Mm-hmm. And really, you know, made a really good guerrilla army with very little weapons that went to war against the greatest empire on earth, you know.
Yes.
So that was the other end of the service in the British Army.
No, that's interesting. No, but I want to thank you for taking time to come on the podcast today and share your story, as well as talking about this really interesting book. So I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to come here anytime, and I just hope I haven't confused your listeners, and I hope they'll be able to make some sense of this. And certainly if you're prepared to knuckle down, if you've got a real heavy snowstorm in the winter, it's the book for you. You can wade through this and learn a bit more about Ireland and you know, what made us the people we are. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 222 with Gerald O'Hara. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.